and genuinely patriotic. Geneva had been required to fight for its religious freedom. Indeed, the separation of religion and civic virtue is not quite as clear as Rousseau or Mandeville suggest. In the following century, the Greek Orthodox Church would be largely responsible for uniting the Greeks in their patriotic struggle for freedom from the Ottoman Turks. Similarly, in the 20th century, the Roman Catholic Church played an integral role in maintaining Polish resistance against their communist oppressors. In such cases, the coming together of politics and religion was a civic benefit. But such effective union is temporary. Only civic religion seeks a permanent union. The Nazi 1,000-year Reich, the communist march toward the inevitable withering away of the state, and similar delusions. In the long run, civic religion invariably proves detrimental to both spiritual values and civic ones. Religious belief and political belief share only the fact that they are both faiths. Meanwhile, Rousseau had won the hearts of many with the publication of his novel Julie, or The New Eloise. The passionate antics of the tutor hero Saint-Preux, whose resemblance to Rousseau even extends to his age, caught the public imagination. All the world loves a lover. Saint-Preux may have been 49, but like his creator he remained a teenager at heart. His seduction of his young pupil, or vice versa, was appreciated for its overheated emotional intensity rather than any relation to reality. Rousseau never in fact became Sophie's lover. Likewise, a middle-aged tutor who seduces his young aristocratic charge and makes her pregnant, as Saint-Preux did Julie, is liable to end up in court, then as now. Not for nothing has Saint-Preux been seen as the predecessor of Humbert Humbert in Lolita. Nonetheless, the appeal of Julie was universal. Here was a description of emotional rapture in an actual setting, the countryside along the shores of Lake Geneva. Despite its ecstasies over the beauty of nature and the joys of love, this was no legendary romance, no pastoral idyll populated by gods and mythical figures. These were real people living domestic lives, people with whom the reader and the writer could identify. And Rousseau's readers responded every bit as enthusiastically as he did. Here was one of the inaugurating works of Romanticism. It is difficult to exaggerate the full import of early Romanticism in Europe. Hero worship, popular idols, emotional identification, role models, all these are now an understood element of modern society. In the mid-18th century, the only heroes and idols available were saints or legendary figures, far removed from everyday experience. Respect and awe were concentrated upon the equally distant figures of rulers, local lords or far-off royalty, and all such veneration was restrained by social and religious norms. Meanwhile, civilized behavior was judged in cultural terms. Civilized emotion, tellingly diffused as sentiment, was similarly elevated and rational. The Enlightenment had inspired widespread intellectual advances and equally widespread emotional repression. The emotional self-confidence of Renaissance humanism had been superseded by the uncertainties of the intellectual search for certainty and the advance of rigorous science. Philosophers now sought to define the emotions rather than liberate them or learn how to live with them. Rousseau's novel addressed a pent-up need, especially among the new breed of educated women. In Julie, Rousseau's expression of emotion is intense and incoherent. This is both its strength and its validity. He did not fully understand himself what he was expressing, but he knew its truth within him. His troubled soul refused to submit to rational restraints. The fire that Rousseau lit would soon become a conflagration. To name the successors to Julie is to record the landmarks of a newly illuminated region in human self-expression. In the following decade, Goethe would write his early Sturm und Drang, Storm and Stress masterpiece, The Sorrows of Young Werther. In music, the classical lyricism of Mozart would soon give way to the turbulent emotionalism of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata and the Eroica, heroic, symphony. Later, Byron would epitomize himself as the gloomy egoist in his autobiographical Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. Young women were far from being the only ones affected by this resurgence of deep emotion. The fictional suicide of Goethe's Werther would inspire a rash of suicides among sensitive young German students. Both men and women fainted during performances of Beethoven, and a generation of European poets, from Pushkin to Leopardi, would idolize Byron. Rousseau followed Julie, or The New Eloise, with another work in the guise of fiction entitled Émile, or On Education. This is in part a novel describing how a rich man's son is educated by his tutor. The narrative is interrupted by long digressions on how this education ought to be conducted, together with philosophical reflections on the very nature of our humanity. The book contains a curious mixture of the romanticism of Julie and the republicanism of the social contract. Where the latter aimed at social liberty, Émile is more concerned with personal liberty and how it enables us to achieve fulfillment, happiness, and wisdom. This is also seen as a suitable education for the young citizens of the ideal republic described in the social contract. Rousseau's attitude toward children marks a watershed in our understanding of this difficult subdivision of humanity. Rousseau's ideas are the foundation of our own ideas on children. In the 18th century, his ideas were considered revolutionary. Before then, children were usually treated as if they were ignorant and unruly miniature adults. During their immaturity, they would simply be dispatched into the hands of a servant or nurse. This person was frequently a peasant, who would herself be regarded as a kind of coarse, overgrown child. In the presence of genuine adults, the dwarfish adult was expected to ape the manners of his or her seniors. Childish behaviour, such as Rousseau knew all too well, was simply unacceptable. There was little or no understanding of what it meant to be a child. This may seem a curious blind spot, considering that all adults had inevitably undergone this experience, but the fact is they had not. For the most part, children had simply not been allowed to be children. Instead, they had been apprentice adults. Tellingly, the saying, "boys will be boys," did not come into use until well into the 19th century. In Émile, Rousseau often shows considerable psychological insight into the behaviour of children. He describes how, during infancy, when a child cries, we try to silence it, either by giving in to its demands or by threatening it. Thus, his first ideas are those of domination and servitude. Before knowing how to speak, he commands. Before being able to act, he obeys. The initial aim of education should be to replace the child's dependence upon adults with a healthy sense of its own independence. Instead of simply conforming to the wishes and ambitions imposed upon it by adults, the child should be allowed to cultivate its own faculties in accordance with its own development. As Rousseau puts it, nature wants children to pass through childhood before becoming men. As can be seen from the preceding quote, Rousseau's children are male. This was not, for the most part, his intention in Émile. In the attempt to include both sexes, I have perhaps perversely rendered the children sexless. Women reading this text may be encouraged by this procedure. Children may have other views. According to Rousseau, to begin with, children exist in a state of nature. This is analogous, though not identical, to the state of nature in which humanity existed before it became civilized, as described in Rousseau's first Discourse. In this early stage, the child has no conception of good and evil. These are imposed upon it by outside forces. In Émile, Rousseau shows how the tutor should do his best to oppose such forces. His aim should be to encourage the child's nature rather than thwart it. Here Rousseau distinguishes between forms of education. The education of the natural human being, who lives for himself alone, should be balanced with the education of the civil human being, whose life is directed toward the community. This latter form of education inevitably restricts the natural humanity of the child, transforming it into a communal nature. The child's independent identity is reduced to a relative identity within society. Only when these different forms of education are successfully combined are the contradictions in our humanity overcome and happiness achieved. As Rousseau explains elsewhere, let us start by becoming what we are, by focusing our attention solely upon ourselves. We should try to discover our true selves, isolating our genuine nature from alien elements which are simply imposed upon it. For only by being ourselves will we ever achieve true knowledge of humanity, and thus be able to enter into the community without losing ourselves. Rousseau admitted that the tutor's task here is not easy. In helping his pupil discover the truth of his own nature, he need not always be truthful himself. As in the larger social sphere, once again Rousseau encourages Machiavellian methods. If deviousness or even plain deceit are necessary to achieve his aim, the tutor must employ such tactics. On the other hand, he should under no circumstances ever resort to corporal punishment. Brainwashing is evidently preferable to beating. This has a recognizable parallel with the community where individuals are forced to be free. As in the social contract, Rousseau has his own unorthodox ideas about religion. both the part it should play and what kind of religion it should be. Where education is concerned, instead of a civil religion, the pupil should be taught a personal religion. Rousseau explains this religion at some length and with typical fervour. This is very much his own version of Christianity. Despite his unorthodoxies, Rousseau would always remain a man of deep religious feeling. Yet his rejection was responsible for uniting the Greeks in their patriotic struggle for freedom from the Ottoman Turks. Similarly, in the 20th century, the Roman Catholic Church played an integral role in maintaining Polish resistance against their communist oppressors. In such cases, the cutting away of the state and similar delusions. In the long run, civic religion invariably proves detrimental to both spiritual values and civic ones. Religious belief and political belief share only the fact that they are both faiths. The coming together of politics and religion was a civic benefit. But such effective union is temporary. Only civic religion seeks a permanent union. The Nazi 1,000-year Reich, the communist march toward the inevitable withering and genuinely patriotic. Geneva had been required to fight for its religious freedom. Indeed, the separation of religion and civic virtue is not quite as clear as Rousseau or Mandeville suggest. In the following century, the Greek Orthodox Church would be largely responsible. Meanwhile, Rousseau had won the hearts of many with the publication of his novel Julie, or The New Eloise. The passionate antics of the tutor hero Saint-Preux, whose resemblance to Rousseau even extends to his age, caught the public